The salt-laced wind was a thief, stealing the warmth from Alani's body and the sound from the world, leaving only a high, keening shriek. Rain, driven horizontal by the gale, plastered strands of dark hair to her face and soaked through the worn canvas of her jacket. Beneath her, the cliff path was a treacherous ribbon of mud and stone, slick with brine and wet leaves. In her arms, the weight was a familiar, terrible burden. Not a rifle, not a pack, but something infinitely more precious. Ghost, her German shepherd, was a dead weight of gray and white fur, his magnificent head lolling against her shoulder, a single, shallow breath misting in the frigid air for every three of her own. The gash on his flank, a deep, ragged tear from whatever they had disturbed in the darkening woods miles back, had finally taken its toll. He had walked until he could not, his stoicism a mirror of her own, until his legs had buckled and he had looked at her with eyes that said, "I am done." She had lifted his 90-pound frame without a second thought. Pain was an old friend, exhaustion a constant companion. She would carry him to the ends of the earth. Tonight, the end of the earth was a broken-down house on a lonely spit of land overlooking the Atlantic, a place she had only ever seen in a faded photograph. It was a legacy, a promise, a last resort. For those who find themselves at the edge of the world, stories of quiet strength and unbreakable bonds can be a beacon in the storm. We hope this story finds you well and that you'll join us for more tales of resilience. Alani adjusted her grip, the muscles in her back and shoulders screaming in protest. Ghost whimpered, a low, guttural sound of pure misery that cut through the howl of the wind and straight into her heart. "Almost there, boy," she murmured, her voice raw and torn by the wind. "Just hold on. Marcus's place. It's got to be here." The name felt strange on her tongue, a ghost of its own. Sergeant Marcus Thorne. The Joker, the optimist, the one who always had a spare ration and a bad joke. The one who had sent her a deed and a key in his final letter, written by a Red Cross nurse. For when the noise gets too loud, Lonnie, go to the sea. It washes everything clean. The noise was a constant roar now, a static scream of sand and fire and things she could never unsee. It had driven her from the cities, from the towns, from the shelters. It had pushed her into the wild, with only Ghost for company, the one living being whose silence was more comforting than any words. He was the last piece of that other life, a canine washout deemed too sensitive for the field. Too sensitive. Like her, they were a matched set of broken tools. A light flickered in the distance, swallowed by the gloom, then reappearing. Not a light, she realized, but a reflection. Moonlight, spearing through a break in the churning clouds, glinting off a window pane. The house. It stood silhouetted against the bruised purple of the sky, a jagged shape like a rotten tooth. It was worse than she had imagined. The porch sagged, the roof was patched with tar paper, and the salt-blasted wood was worn to a silver gray. But it was there. It was real. It was shelter. Her boots slid in the mud, and she went down on one knee, the impact jarring her teeth. Ghost cried out, a sharp yelp of agony. "Sorry," she gasped, scrambling for purchase. "I'm sorry, Ghost." She pushed herself up, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and desperation. She half-climbed, half-crawled the last 50 yards, her lungs burning, her vision tunneling. The house loomed over them, its windows like vacant eyes. The air beneath the porch roof was still, the roar of the wind slightly muffled. She fumbled in her pocket with numb fingers, pulling out the old, tarnished brass key. It felt impossibly small, impossibly fragile. The lock was stiff with rust and salt. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought it wouldn't turn. She put her shoulder into the door, rattling it in its frame, and twisted the key with all her remaining strength. The lock gave with a tortured screech. The door swung inward on groaning hinges, opening into a pitch-black space that smelled of dust, brine, and something else. Resignation. The smell of a place long abandoned. She shuffled inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic drumming of rain on the roof and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She lowered Ghost gently to the floorboards. In the gloom, she could just make out the pale fur of his ruff. She ran a hand over his head, his ears cold and limp. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Okay. First things first, She shrugged off her sodden pack, her movements stiff and automatic. Years of training took over, pushing past the pain and the fear. Assess, prioritize, act. The muscle memory was a comfort. Light, shelter, medical. She found a book of matches in a waterproof pouch. The first one sputtered and died. The second flared to life, a tiny, defiant sun in the oppressive darkness. She cupped it in her hand, her shadow a giant, dancing monster on the walls. The room was sparse. A stone fireplace, choked with old ash. A single wooden chair. A small table. Bare floorboards. It was a monk's cell, not a home. Her gaze fell on a stack of dry firewood and kindling laid neatly beside the hearth. A final act of kindness from Marcus, or whoever had been here last. Gratitude, sharp and painful, pierced through her exhaustion. She lit the kindling. It caught slowly, then with a hungry crackle. Flames began to lick at the larger logs, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. The shadows retreated to the corners. Now Ghost. She knelt beside him, her heart a cold knot in her chest. The firelight illuminated the wound. It was worse than she'd thought in the fading light of the woods. Long and deep, it oozed blood sluggishly, matting the fur. Infection was the enemy now. She unzipped a side pocket of her pack and pulled out her old IFAK, her individual first aid kit. Inside, nestled amongst the combat gauze and tourniquets, was a suture kit, antiseptic wipes, and a small bottle of saline. Relics of a life where she had patched up men, not dogs. The principles were the same. Stop the bleeding. Clean the wound. Close it up. She worked with a focused intensity, the world shrinking to the small pool of firelight and the task at hand. She cleaned the gash with the saline, her touch gentle but firm. Ghost flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he didn't snap. He trusted her. The trust was a weight, a responsibility she felt in her very bones. He had been her anchor through the long, drifting years. He had licked away tears she hadn't known she was crying, had woken her from nightmares with a wet nose and a worried whine. He had been her firewatch, her scout, her confessor. Now it was her turn to hold the line for him. The needle was cold and sharp. Her hands, though trembling with cold and fatigue, were steady as she pushed it through his skin. One stitch, then another. The movements were precise, practiced. She was no vet, but she had sewn up enough soldiers in the back of shuddering strikers to know the rhythm. Pull, not snip. Pull, not snip. The world outside the windows raged, the sea a roaring beast, but inside the small house, a fragile piece was being woven, one suture at a time. As she tied the final knot, a profound weariness washed over her, so heavy it was almost a physical blow. She bandaged the wound with the last of her clean gauze, then collapsed onto the floorboards beside him. The fire crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the dark. Ghost sighed, a long, shuddering exhalation, and rested his head on her thigh. She laid her hand on his side, feeling the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. The house, Marcus's house, wrapped them in its dusty silence. The noise in her head, for the first time in a long time, was just a whisper. The storm broke sometime before dawn, its fury spent. Alani awoke to a world washed in pale, watery light and a profound silence. The only sounds were the gentle crackle of embers in the fireplace and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the waves receding from the shore. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was unfamiliar, rough-hewn beams dark with age. The air smelled of wood smoke, salt, and old dust. Then she felt the weight on her leg. Ghost was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. She shifted, her body screaming a protest of sore muscles and bruised bones. She gently checked his bandage. It was clean, no sign of fresh bleeding. His fever had broken, his ears were cool to the touch. Relief, pure and clean as the morning air, washed through her. They had made it. They were safe. She eased herself up, moving with the stiff grace of an old woman, and limped to the single grime-streaked window. The view stole the breath from her lungs. The house stood on the very edge of a high, grassy bluff. Below, a crescent of white sand curved into a turquoise cove, the water so clear she could see the dark shapes of rocks beneath the surface. The ocean stretched to the horizon, a vast expanse of shimmering silver blue under a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. It was beautiful, so beautiful it hurt to look at. It was the kind of beauty she had forgotten existed, a world away from the dust-choked grays and browns that colored her memories. Marcus had been right. The sea. It washes everything clean. Ghost stirred behind her, and she turned to see him struggling to his feet. He was unsteady, favoring his wounded side, but he was up. He padded over to her, his tail giving a weak, tentative thump-thump against her leg. He nudged his head under her hand, his amber eyes fixed on her face, a look of profound, trusting allegiance in them. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "Look at that. We're still here." He followed her gaze out the window, a low rumble of contentment in his chest. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Alani felt a flicker of something that wasn't dread or exhaustion. It was a fragile, unfamiliar sensation. Hope. They spent the morning in quiet recovery. Alani found a pump in the small, lean-to kitchen at the back of the house. After a dozen rusty, protesting groans, it brought up clear, cold water from the well. It tasted of iron and earth, the best thing she had ever drunk. She shared it with Ghost, who lapped greedily from his collapsible bowl. There was no food in the house, but for now, water was enough. She needed to explore, to take stock of her new territory. Leaving Ghost to rest by the fire, she stepped outside. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of salt and wet earth and pine from a stand of wind-stunted trees that clung to the landward side of the bluff. The house was even more decrepit in the full light of day. The paint had been scoured away by years of wind and salt, the wood beneath weathered to the color of driftwood. The porch steps groaned under her weight. Yet it was solid. The stone foundation was sunk deep into the earth, and the roof, though patched, looked sound. It had the feel of a place that had endured. It had good bones. As she circled the small structure, she found a small, wooden table on the back porch, sheltered from the main force of the wind. On it, held down by a smooth, gray stone, was a plastic freezer bag. Inside was a letter. Her heart gave a painful lurch. It was Marcus's handwriting, the same looping, careless scrawl from his letters home. "Lonnie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means two things. 1, I didn't make it back. 2, you finally took my advice and ran for the coast. Don't be sad about the first part. We both knew the odds. But I'm glad about the second. I bought this place with my bonus money a few years back. Never even spent a night in it. I just liked knowing it was here. A place to get away from the noise. I'm leaving it to you. Not because you need a handout, I know you better than that. But because I think you need a place to be quiet. A place where you can hear yourself think again. Or not think. Whatever works. The well is good, the fishing is better. The town is a few miles east down the coast road. It's called Port Blossom. They're a strange bunch, but mostly harmless. Don't let them give you any crap. The key also opens the shed out back. There's a generator and some tools. Maybe you can fix the place up. Or maybe you can just sit on the porch and watch the waves. It's yours, Lonnie. Your post. Guard it well. Find some peace for both of us. Marcus." She read the letter twice, her vision blurring. She sank onto the porch step, the rough wood pressing into her legs. "Your post. Guard it well." He had always spoken her language. He understood. This wasn't charity. It was a mission. Her final mission. To find peace. A tear slid down her cheek, hot and surprising. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, a small, dark spot on the weathered wood. After a long time, she stood up and walked to the shed. The brass key worked on this lock too. Inside, it was dusty and smelled of oil and rust. But as Marcus had promised, there was a small generator, cans of fuel, a well-stocked toolbox, fishing rods, and neatly coiled ropes. He had left her everything she needed to survive. To rebuild. She spent the afternoon taking inventory, her mind falling into the familiar, comforting rhythm of logistics and planning. The tasks grounded her. Check the fuel, inspect the tools, clear the cobwebs. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, she went back into the house. Ghost was waiting at the door, his posture alert. He was standing, not lying down, and his ears were pricked. He wasn't looking at her, but toward the beach below. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Alani asked softly, coming to stand beside him. She looked out the window again. The cove was empty. The waves washed ashore in a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. There was nothing there. Just sand and water and the evening light. Ghost growled again, a little louder this time, his gaze fixed on a point at the far end of the cove where the cliffs curved back toward the sea. "It's nothing," she said, trying to soothe him. "Just the wind. Your nerves are shot." But he didn't relax. He remained a statue of tense muscle and fur, a sentinel staring at an unseen enemy. Her own senses, honed by years of watching for threats that were invisible until it was too late, went on high alert. She scanned the beach, the tree line, the surface of the water. Nothing. No movement. No sound but the sea. And yet, she trusted his instincts more than her own. He was her early warning system, the canary in her coal mine. His unease was a cold finger tracing its way down her spine. The peace of the morning felt fragile now, a thin veneer over something else. Something she couldn't see. The noise Marcus had talked about. Maybe it wasn't just in her head. Maybe it was out here, too, just waiting in the long shadows of the setting sun. The gnawing in Alani's stomach was a dull ache that had become a part of her, but Ghost needed more than water and rest. He needed protein to heal. The small fishing village Marcus had mentioned, Port Blossom, was a necessity. She checked Ghost's wound one last time. It was clean and dry, the skin already beginning to knit together. He was still weak, but the immediate danger had passed. "I'll be back," she said, her voice quiet in the morning stillness of the house. She filled his water bowl and placed it by the hearth where the embers still glowed. "You're on watch. Let no one pass." Ghost seemed to understand. He settled onto the floor, his head on his paws, but his eyes were open, alert, and fixed on the door. He was a soldier on his post. The trust was a quiet, steady warmth inside her. The coast road was more of a suggestion than a road, a winding track of packed dirt and gravel that hugged the cliffs. The 3-mile hike was invigorating. The clean, salt-scrubbed air filled her lungs, and the rhythmic crash of the waves below was a steady, calming drumbeat. She moved with a long, ground-eating stride, her pack light on her back. For the first time in years, she felt the simple pleasure of her own body's strength, not as a weapon, but just as a part of her. Port Blossom appeared around a bend, nestled in a deep inlet. It was a postcard picture of a New England fishing town. Weather-beaten clapboard houses clung to the hillside, a white-steepled church stood sentinel, and the harbor was a forest of masts from a small fleet of fishing boats. But as she got closer, she saw the cracks in the facade. Some of the boats were listing, their paint peeling, nets rotting on their decks. Several storefronts on the main street were boarded up. There was a quiet desperation clinging to the place, like the persistent smell of low tide. Her presence did not go unnoticed. As she walked down the main street, conversations quieted. Faces appeared in windows. She was an outsider, a variable in a closed system, and her military-straight posture and the hard-won economy of her movements marked her as different. She ignored the stares, her face a neutral mask. She was used to being watched. Her first stop was the general store. A small bell jingled as she entered. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee, sawdust, and something sweet, like cinnamon. A young woman with a spray of freckles across her nose and tired eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" she asked, her tone flat, not unfriendly but not welcoming either. "Need some supplies," Alani said, her voice clipped. "Dog food. Canned goods. Coffee." The woman, whose name tag read Jenna, nodded. "Dog food's in the back, aisle 3. Canned stuff's aisle 1. Coffee's right here." Alani gathered what she needed, her movements efficient. A large bag of high-protein kibble, cans of stew and beans, a brick of coffee, salt, matches, a new lantern. As she browsed, she kept her ears open, a habit so ingrained she didn't even notice she was doing it. 2 older men in flannel shirts and worn jeans were talking near the back of the store, their voices low and rough. "Another one this morning," one said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Washed up right by the old pier. Belly up. Looked wrong. It's that Ethel," the other man spat. "Ever since they started that preliminary surveying upriver, the catch has been thin and the fish we do get are sick. Tastes like metal. Sheriff says it's just a natural algae bloom. Sheriff says what Ethel pays him to say. He ain't been on our side for a long time." The first man sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Don't know how much longer we can hold on, Bill. The boys at Ethel are talking jobs. Good paying ones. Hard to tell a man with hungry kids he can't take a paycheck just cause the water tastes funny. Alani filed the information away. Ethel Corporation surveying. Sick fish. A compromised sheriff. It was a familiar story, a small-town variation on a theme she had seen play out in bigger, dustier places overseas. A powerful outside force, a divided local population, and a creeping corruption that poisoned everything it touched. She paid for her supplies, her interaction with Jenna brief and professional. As she stepped back out into the street, she saw them. Two gleaming white pickup trucks with the Ethel Corp logo, a stylized green leaf cupped in a blue, were parked near the town dock. The men leaning against them were a stark contrast to the weathered fishermen. They wore clean work boots, crisp company polos, and hard hats that looked like they'd never seen a day of actual labor. They had the hard, watchful eyes of security contractors, not surveyors. They were occupiers. One of them met her gaze, his eyes lingering a moment too long, a flicker of professional assessment in his look. He was cataloging her. Height, weight, threat level. She met his stare without flinching, then deliberately looked away, dismissing him. A small act of psychological warfare. Let him wonder. Her business in town wasn't finished. She needed information from the source. She walked toward the docks, the smell of fish, diesel, and salt growing stronger. She found the man from the store, the one named Bill, mending a net on the deck of a tired-looking trawler named the Sea Serpent. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and sea, his hands gnarled but surprisingly deft as he worked the thick twine. "Your Bill?" she asked, her voice carrying easily over the cries of the gulls. He looked up, his eyes a startlingly pale blue in his tanned face. "Might be. Who's a skin?" His dialect was thick, the vowels long and rounded. "Name's Alani. I'm staying out at the old Thorn place." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Marcus's place. Heard he didn't come home. Shame. He was a good lad. Sent his folks a check every month." He squinted at her. "You military?" "Used to be," she said. It was the simplest answer. He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. "Heard you talking in the store," she went on, getting straight to the point. "About Ethel Corporation." Bill's face hardened. He stopped his work and looked around the dock, his gaze lingering on the white trucks. "Nothing to talk about," he said, his voice dropping. "Just a company bringing progress to Port Blossom." The words were rote, rehearsed. The lie was plain on his face. Alani didn't push. She just stood there, her silence a weight. She had learned overseas that sometimes the most effective interrogation technique was to say nothing at all. Let the other person fill the void. Bill went back to his net, his movements now jerky and angry. "They promised jobs," he muttered, more to his net than to her. "Plant upriver. Processing facility. Eco-friendly, they say. But the water's dying. We can all taste it. We can see it in the nets. But what are we supposed to do? Fight a giant with lawyers and money? We're just fishermen. What are they surveying for?" Alani asked, her voice still quiet. He finally looked up at her, his pale eyes full of a frustrated fire. "They say it's for environmental impact. I say it's to see how much poison the cove can take before it's dead for good." He gestured with his head toward the sea. "That water is our life. It's been our life for generations. And they're killing it for a quarterly report." The raw pain in his voice resonated with something deep inside Alani. She understood defending a way of life. She understood watching something you loved be destroyed by an outside force you couldn't fight. She nodded once, a gesture of understanding and respect. "Thank you for the information, Bill. Information ain't gonna do you no good," he grumbled, turning back to his net. "Best thing for you to do is stay out at the Thorn place and keep your head down. This ain't your fight." But as she turned to leave, shouldering her pack, she knew he was wrong. It wasn't her fight. Not yet. But they were threatening her post. They were bringing the noise to the one quiet place she had left. And that made it personal. The walk back to the house was different. The beauty of the coastline was still there, but now it was overlaid with a sense of menace. The clear water in the coves seemed less pristine, the whisper of the wind in the pines less benign. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Alani moved with a renewed purpose, her senses on high alert. The conversation in the store, Bill's bitter words, the hard-eyed men from Ethel Corp. It all coalesced into a familiar pattern. Infiltration, subjugation, destruction. She was a guest in this place, but Marcus had charged her with its defense. Guard it well. The mission parameters were becoming clearer. When she reached the bluff, Ghost was waiting for her on the porch, a silent gray and white sentinel. He greeted her with a reserved dignity, a sweep of his tail and a press of his head against her hand. But his eyes were drawn back to the beach, to the same spot at the far end of the cove. His unease hadn't faded. It had sharpened. "All right, boy," Alani said, dropping her pack inside the door. "Show me." She trusted him implicitly. A dog's senses don't lie, and Ghosts were honed by breeding and training. If he said there was something wrong, there was something wrong. She grabbed a pair of old binoculars from Marcus's shed and they set off, not down the main path to the beach, but through the tangled woods that bordered the cliff's edge. Alani moved with a practiced stealth, her footfalls silent on the pine needle-strewn ground. Ghost patted at her heel, a silent shadow. They were a team, moving with the fluid coordination born of countless miles traveled together. She found a vantage point in a thicket of scrub pine that overlooked the entire cove, offering a clear view of the area that had so disturbed Ghost. She raised the binoculars, the world jumping into magnified focus. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just rocks, white water where the waves broke, and the dark green of seaweed clinging to the shoreline. But Ghost was insistent, nudging her hand with his nose, a low whine in his throat. "Look closer." She adjusted the focus, scanning the waterline inch by inch. And then she saw it. It was almost perfectly camouflaged, a dark circle against the dark, wet rock of the cliff face, just above the high tide line. It looked like a natural shadow, a small cave entrance, perhaps. But the shape was too perfect, too round. It was a pipe, a large diameter pipe, at least 2 feet across, angled downward toward the water. It was clearly man-made. She watched it for a long time. Nothing happened. The waves crashed and receded. Gulls wheeled overhead. It was just a pipe. Maybe it was an old storm drain, long abandoned. But Ghost was still tense beside her, his body rigid. He knew. "Wait," his posture seemed to say. "Watch." So she waited. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The salt spray misted her face. The patience was something the army had drilled into her. The long, boring hours of observation that preceded a few moments of terror. This was no different. An hour passed, then another. Just as she was about to dismiss it, to pack up and form a new plan, she saw a flicker of movement near the pipe. Not from the pipe itself, but from the cliff face above it. A section of what looked like solid rock and tangled brush swung outward, revealing a hidden access door. 2 men in Ethel Corp uniforms emerged, carrying testing equipment. They moved with a casual efficiency that spoke of routine. One of them knelt by the pipe's outlet, while the other spoke into a radio. Alani's blood ran cold. This was no abandoned drain. This was active. This was the source. As if on cue, a plume of discolored liquid pulsed from the mouth of the pipe. It was a sickly, translucent brown, swirling with an oily, rainbow sheen as it hit the clear seawater. It dissipated quickly, but the stain it left in the water was undeniable. The smell hit her a moment later, carried on the breeze. A sharp, acrid chemical odor, like burnt plastic and bitter almonds. The scent was a key, unlocking a door in her mind she had long ago nailed shut. Suddenly, she wasn't on a cliff in Maine. She was back in the Zabul province, the air thick with the dust of 1,000 years and the smell of a roadside bomb. The striker in front of hers, gone. Just a cloud of black smoke and the same, hideous chemical stench. The shriek of metal, the screams of her friends, the coppery taste of fear in her mouth. The world dissolved into a cacophony of panicked radio calls and the roar of a fire she couldn't extinguish. Her breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The binoculars slipped from her numb fingers. The noise in her head was a physical force, a tidal wave of static and terror. "Easy, Lonnie. Easy." The voice was a low whisper in the chaos of her memory. It wasn't a memory. It was real. A wet nose pushed insistently against her cheek. A heavy weight settled on her lap. Ghost. He had broken his stay, recognizing the signs of her distress. He was whining, a high, anxious sound, and licking the tears she hadn't realized were streaming down her face. He pushed his head under her chin, forcing her to look at him, to see him. His amber eyes were filled with a deep, unwavering concern. He was her anchor. He was real. The cliff was real. The sea was real. She gasped, sucking in a lungful of clean, salt air. The images from the past receded, fading back into the dark corners of her mind. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of the flashback. "Okay," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She wrapped her arms around Ghost's thick neck, burying her face in his fur. "I'm okay, boy. You got me." He stayed with her until the shaking stopped, a warm, solid presence grounding her in the here and now. When she finally lifted her head, her mind was startlingly clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. They had brought their poison here. They had brought the stench of death to her sanctuary. They had triggered her past and threatened her future. Bill was wrong. The men from Ethel were wrong. This was her fight now. They had just made it official. The anger was a clean, cold flame in her chest, burning away the fog of trauma and indecision. This was a problem set. It had variables, threats, and objectives. It was a language she understood. Objective: expose Ethel Corporation, stop the poisoning. Protect the cove. Protect her post. First, she needed proof. Hard evidence. The testimony of frightened fishermen wasn't enough. Her own eyewitness account was a start, but it was her word against the corporation's. She needed something tangible. She waited until dusk, until the Ethel Corp technicians had completed their work and retreated back through their hidden door. The light was fading fast, the sky bleeding from orange to deep indigo. Under the cloak of growing darkness, she and Ghost made their way down a treacherous goat path to the rocky shore. The air near the pipe was thick with the chemical smell, a nauseating perfume that made her stomach churn and put Ghost's hackles on end. He stayed close, a low growl a constant vibration in his chest. Alani pulled an empty water bottle from her pack. Wading into the knee-deep, frigid water, she held the bottle under the surface near the pipe's outlet, letting it fill with the tainted seawater. As she screwed the cap on tight, she could see the oily residue clinging to the inside of the plastic. This was Exhibit A. She didn't head back to the house. Instead, she found a concealed position higher up the cliff, a small alcove in the rock that offered a commanding view of the pipe and the surrounding area. She settled in for a long night of observation. This was her tradecraft: patience, observation, pattern analysis. She needed to know their security protocols. How often did they patrol? What were their routes? Their numbers? The night was long and cold. Ghost lay beside her, a warm, living furnace, his ears constantly swiveling, cataloging the sounds of the night. He was the perfect partner, his senses an extension of her own. Twice, a patrol passed along the cliff-top path above them. Two men, moving with the quiet professionalism of ex-military. They swept the area with high-powered flashlights. Alani and Ghost remained perfectly still, shadows within a shadow, until the beams passed and the sound of their footsteps faded. They were good, but she was better. She had spent years learning how to disappear. Before dawn, she noted a final patrol, and then the area fell quiet. They had a routine. Predictable. Predictability was a weakness she could exploit. She slipped back to the house as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. She was bone-tired, but her mind was sharp, focused. After a few hours of restless sleep, she cleaned herself up, put on the least worn clothes she had, and hiked back to Port Blossom. The bottle of contaminated water was wrapped in a cloth and tucked deep in her pack. She went straight to the docks, finding Bill on his boat, splicing a rope. He looked up as she approached, his expression wary. "You again," he grunted. "I brought you something," she said, her voice low. She unwrapped the bottle and held it out. "From the cove. West of here. There's a pipe." Bill took the bottle, his brow furrowed. He unscrewed the cap and sniffed. His face, already weathered and grim, seemed to collapse. The color drained from his cheeks. "Mother of God," he whispered, his voice thick with horror and a strange, terrible kind of validation. "This is it. This is the smell. They have a hidden access panel on the cliff face. Two-man patrols, looks like every 4 hours at night," Alani said, laying out the facts like a field report. "They're dumping waste directly into the ocean." Bill stared at her, his pale blue eyes wide. The fisherman's skepticism was gone, replaced by a dawning respect and fear. "I knew it," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "I knew they were lying. But proof, what can we do with it? Like I said, the sheriff's on their payroll. He'll say we faked it. He'll say we're just disgruntled fishermen. The sheriff isn't the only authority," Alani stated simply. "There are state agencies. Environmental protection. The media, they'll tie it up in court for years, Bill countered, his brief flicker of hope already dying. They've got an army of lawyers. They'll bleed us dry. They'll say it's not them, that the pipe is from some old factory. They'll deny everything. Then we get proof they can't deny. Alani said, her voice hard as flint. We need to link that pipe directly to their new facility upriver. We need shipping manifests, chemical orders, internal memos. Something that proves they're using the chemicals that are ending up in this water. The old fisherman looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just an outsider, a drifter, but a woman with a core of steel. He saw a soldier. You're talking about going to war with them, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm talking about defending your home, she corrected him. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the bottle in his gnarled hand. He looked out at the harbor, at the boats that were his life, his father's life, his grandfather's life. He looked toward the town, where his children and grandchildren lived. Jenna, he said finally, his voice firm. The girl at the store. Her brother took a job at the plant a month ago. Security. He's a good kid, but his wife's sick. They need the insurance. He's been saying things aren't right up there. Maybe he can help, a new piece on the board. An inside man. The plan was beginning to form, a fragile framework of possibilities. Alani gave a single, sharp nod. Talk to him. See what he knows. But be careful. They're not just surveyors, Bill. Their security is professional. They'll be watching their own people. I've been keeping secrets from my wife for 40 years, Bill said with a grim smile. I think I can handle a few corporate thugs. As Alani turned to leave, he called after her. Alani, why? Why are you doing this? It ain't your town. It ain't your water. She paused, her back to him. She thought of Marcus's letter, of the peace she had felt for one brief morning, of the chemical smell that brought back the ghosts. She thought of Ghost, her loyal companion, wounded by something that had crawled out of the poisoned darkness. They're on my post, she said, and walked away, leaving the old fisherman staring after her, the bottle of toxic water clutched in his hand like a grenade. The fragile piece of the bluff was gone, replaced by the electric hum of impending conflict. Alani returned to the house not as a refugee seeking sanctuary, but as a soldier preparing a forward operating base. The Ethel Corp men had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated her. They saw a homeless woman, a drifter. They didn't see the training, the discipline, the quiet lethality that had been forged in the crucible of war. She expected them. It was the next logical step in their playbook. Intimidation. A show of force to encourage the undesirable element to move on. She didn't have to wait long. They came in the late afternoon, when the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that their gleaming white trucks sliced through. They didn't use the coast road. They used a private access track that cut through the woods, another sign of their resources and their arrogance. They assumed she wouldn't have noticed it. She had. Ghost gave the first warning, a low growl from his position on the porch. He rose to his feet, the fur along his spine bristling. He didn't bark. He was a trained military dog. He didn't make noise unless it was necessary. He simply stood, a statue of potential violence, his gaze locked on the approaching vehicle. Alani was already moving. She put the fresh pot of coffee on the table and stood by the door, her posture relaxed, her hands empty and visible. Never let them see you as a threat until the moment you become one. The truck crunched to a halt 50 feet from the house. Two men got out. One was the man from town, the one with the assessing eyes. The other was bigger, thicker through the shoulders and neck, with a face like a clenched fist. They were the A-team, not the technicians from the cliff. Ma'am, the first one said, his voice a smooth, corporate baritone that didn't match his predatory stillness. He stopped a good 10 feet from the porch steps, a practice distance. Not too close to be threatening, not too far to seem weak. Name's Henderson, head of site security for Ethel Corporation. Hope we're not disturbing you. You are, Alani said, her tone flat. Ghost growled again, a deeper, more menacing rumble this time. Henderson's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Alani. A flicker of professional respect crossed his face. That's a fine-looking animal, he said. German Shepherd. Looks like he's had some training. He has, Alani confirmed. The unspoken message was clear. So have I. Look, we'll get straight to the point, Henderson continued, dropping the pretense of pleasantry. We're conducting some sensitive environmental surveys in this area. For liability reasons, we need to keep the site clear. This property has been flagged as abandoned for years. We'd appreciate it if you'd move along. In fact, he pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. Ethel is prepared to offer you $5,000 for your trouble. To help you get settled somewhere else. The offer was an insult, a test. It was the kind of money they thought would buy a vagrant. Alani didn't even look at the envelope. This property isn't abandoned, she said. It's mine. Henderson's smile was thin, humorless. We checked the county records. The deed is in the name of a Marcus Thorne, declared deceased 2 years ago. The property is in probate, tied up in a mess of military bureaucracy. Legally, you're trespassing. The deed was left to me, she said. The bureaucracy will catch up eventually. I'm not leaving. The bigger man shifted his weight, a silent, menacing movement. Henderson held up a hand to stop him. He was still trying to play the reasonable one. Ma'am, perhaps you don't understand. This is private Ethel Corp operational territory now. For your own safety, you need to vacate the premises. For my safety, Alani repeated, her voice laced with a dry irony that was lost on them. I think I'll stay right here. The stalemate stretched, the silence thick with unspoken threats. The only sound was the wind and the low growl from Ghost's chest. Henderson's eyes were cold, calculating. He was reevaluating her. She wasn't just a squatter. She was an obstacle. Have it your way, he said, his voice losing its smooth veneer, replaced by a hard edge. But I'd advise you to reconsider. This can be a dangerous coastline. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen. An accident. He let the word hang in the air. He turned and walked back to the truck, his partner falling into step behind him. They got in. The engine roared to life, and the truck disappeared back into the woods. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a direct promise. Alani stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded completely. The quiet that descended was heavier, more ominous than before. They had drawn a line in the sand. She looked down at Ghost. He was still rigid, watching the woods where the truck had vanished. Looks like we're holding this position, boy, she murmured, scratching him behind the ears. His tail gave a single, firm thump against her leg. He understood. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a defensive position. She worked with a grim, focused energy, her mind a whirl of tactical considerations. She used rope and a series of old tin cans to create a simple but effective early warning system on the paths leading to the house. She reinforced the flimsy back door with a heavy crossbar fashioned from a piece of driftwood. She checked the windows, ensuring the old latches were as secure as they could be. She cleaned and oiled the few tools from the shed that could be used as weapons, a heavy-duty wrench, a small hatchet. It wasn't an arsenal, but it was something. She was outgunned, outnumbered. But she had the terrain, the element of surprise, and a righteous fury on her side. And she had Ghost. As darkness fell, she didn't light a fire. A fire would make them a target. They sat in the dark, eating cold beans from a can. The house was a dark, silent fortress on the edge of the world. Alani felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The drifting was over. The running was over. The noise in her head was gone, replaced by the crystalline clarity of a mission. She had a post to defend. She had a promise to keep. Let them come. The next 2 days were a war of nerves. Alani and Ghost fell into a routine dictated by vigilance. They slept in short shifts, never at the same time. They patrolled the perimeter of the bluff at irregular intervals, always moving undercover, using the terrain to their advantage. The Ethel Corp patrols were a constant presence, their white trucks occasionally visible on the distant access road, their men sometimes spotted as distant figures on the cliff tops. They were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, or perhaps just trying to wear her down with psychological pressure. But Alani's will was a fortress they could not breach. She had been worn down by things far more terrifying than men in clean uniforms. On the 3rd day, a familiar figure appeared on the coast road, walking with the slow, rolling gait of a lifelong seaman. It was Bill. Alani watched him approach through the binoculars, her hand resting on Ghost's head to keep him quiet. The old fisherman was taking a risk coming here. She met him at the edge of the woods, away from the exposed clearing around the house. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice low. They're watching this place, let him watch, Bill grunted, his face grim. They can't stop an old man from talking a walk. I talked to Jenna's brother. The kid, his name is Kevin. He's scared, but he's angry too. He said they've been having safety drills at night, but there's no alarm. They just shut down a section of the plant, and a tanker truck with no markings leaves the facility. He's timed it. The truck always heads east, towards the old logging roads that lead out to this stretch of coast. It was the link. The missing piece. A tanker truck, leaving the plant, heading for the pipe. He said there are manifests in the supervisor's office. Bill continued, his voice barely a whisper. Locked filing cabinet. The supervisor is a company man, a real piece of work. Kevin can't get near it, he doesn't have to, Alani said, her mind already working, piecing together a plan. We just need to get the supervisor out of his office. We need a diversion? Something to draw all their attention. Something they can't ignore. Bill looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. What are you thinking? You said the town is divided, Alani said. How many are on your side? How many are angry enough to do something? There are a few of us, Bill admitted. Old-timers mostly. The ones who haven't been bought off by the promise of a paycheck. We meet at the church basement sometimes. Talk. Complain. It's not much, it's a start, Alani said. It's a network. We can use it. That evening, under the cloak of a moonless sky, Alani slipped away from the house, leaving Ghost on guard. She moved through the darkness like a wraith, following the coastline until she reached the outskirts of Port Blossom. She met Bill near the old, salt-crusted cemetery behind the church. One by one, others arrived. There were 4 of them besides Bill. 2 other fishermen, grizzled and grim-faced, and Jenna from the general store, her young face set with a fierce determination. They gathered behind a large, granite monument, their faces pale in the faint starlight. Alani didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid out the situation with the cold, efficient clarity of a mission briefing. She told them about the pipe, the patrols, the threat against her. She showed them the bottle of contaminated water. Jenna gasped when she saw the oily sheen on its surface. My son, Jenna said, her voice shaking with a quiet fury. He's been getting rashes. The doctor said it was just eczema. This is our water, one of the fishermen said, his voice a low growl. Our children swim in that cove in the summer. The fear in the small group was palpable, but beneath it, something else was hardening. Resolve. What do you want us to do? Bill asked, his voice the steady anchor in the group. We need to get proof that will stand up, Alani explained. Kevin, Jenna's brother, needs to get into his supervisor's office and photograph the manifests. To do that, he needs a window of opportunity. That's our part. We create a diversion at the main gate of the plant. A protest. Something loud enough to draw the security focus, including the supervisor. They'll have us arrested, Jenna said, her voice tight with anxiety. A protest is legal, Alani countered, and it's better than letting them poison your children. We time it to coincide with the next night's shipment. Kevin gets the documents, sends them to a real reporter, not the local paper, and to the state EPA. At the same time, I'll be at the pipe. I'm going to get video evidence of them actively dumping the waste from that truck. We hit them from both sides, with undeniable proof. The plan hung in the air, audacious and dangerous. These were fishermen and shopkeepers, not soldiers. They were being asked to go up against a powerful, ruthless corporation. Why should we trust you? One of the fishermen asked, his skepticism a raw nerve. You're an outsider. Alani met his gaze in the darkness. Because I have nothing to gain from this except a quiet place to live. You have everything to lose if you do nothing. I know how to fight enemies like this. They rely on you being scared. They rely on you being alone. Right now, in this cemetery, you're not alone. She let the silence stretch. The decision had to be theirs. Finally, it was Jenna who spoke, her voice clear and strong. Bill's right. They're killing our town. They're killing the ocean. My brother will do it. And I'll be at that gate. One by one, the others nodded. A silent, solemn pact made in the graveyard of their ancestors. The plan was set. They would act in 2 nights, during the next projected shipment. As Alani slipped back into the darkness, heading for her post, she felt a flicker of that same fragile hope she had felt on the first morning. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for them. The mission had expanded. She had a fire team. The air on the night of the operation was thick and heavy, the sky choked with low-hanging clouds that swallowed the stars and promised rain. A coastal storm was brewing, a fitting backdrop for the conflict to come. The wind was picking up, moaning through the pines on the bluff and whipping the sea into a frenzy of whitecaps. Pathetic fallacy, she thought with a flicker of grim humor. The world reflecting the turmoil within. Alani moved through the descending darkness with Ghost at her side. She was dressed in dark clothing, her face streaked with mud for camouflage. In her pack, she carried a small digital camera with night vision capabilities, a length of rope, and her small collection of makeshift weapons. She was back in her element. The familiar weight of the pack, the adrenaline singing in her veins, the crystalline focus of the mission. It pushed away the ghosts, leaving only the present moment, sharp and clear. According to the plan, Bill, Jenna, and the others would be starting their protest at the Ethel plant's main gate in less than an hour. Their job was to be loud, disruptive, and just enough of a nuisance to draw the attention of the site's supervisor, pulling him from his office. That would be Kevin's window. He would have minutes, maybe less, to get the photos and get out. It was a long shot, a plan held together by the courage of ordinary people. Alani's part of the mission was more direct. She had to document the illegal dump. She needed video of the unmarked tanker truck, the connection to the pipe, and the waste flowing into the sea. It was the visual proof that would hang them. She and Ghost took a wide, circuitous route, avoiding the known patrol paths. The wind was their ally, masking the sound of their movement. The terrain was treacherous in the dark, a maze of sharp rocks and slippery inclines. But Alani moved with a confidence born of careful reconnaissance. She knew this ground now. It was her battlefield. They reached their final observation point, the same hidden alcove she had used before, with time to spare. From here, she had a clear, defensible view of the discharge pipe. The sea below was a chaotic mass of black water and churning foam, the roar of the waves a constant thunder. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and stinging. Ghost lay beside her, perfectly still, a tense coil of muscle and fur. His senses were stretched to their limit, his ears parsing the sounds of the storm, filtering out the irrelevant, listening for the specific signature of their enemy. An hour crawled by, then another. Alani's patience was a deep, calm well. Doubt began to creep in. Had the plan failed? Had Kevin been caught? Had the protest fizzled out? Then, Ghost's head came up. His ears locked forward. A low, almost subsonic growl vibrated through the rock they were lying on. He had heard it before she did. The sound of an engine, grinding in low gear, straining against the incline of the logging road. Headlights cut a swath through the rain-swept darkness, then winked out. The truck was here. Alani's heart began to pound, a steady, controlled rhythm. This was it. She raised the camera, switching it to night vision. The world turned a ghostly green. She watched as the hidden panel on the cliff face swung open. Two men emerged, their forms distorted in the green glow of the viewfinder. They weren't the usual technicians. They were bigger, and they carried rifles. Henderson's security team. They were expecting trouble. A moment later, the unmarked tanker truck backed carefully into position near the access panel. It was a coordinated, practiced operation. The men moved with grim efficiency, uncoiling a thick hose from the side of the truck. One of them connected it to a valve near the hidden door, a valve that obviously fed directly to the discharge pipe below. Alani started recording. She zoomed in, capturing the details. The men's faces, the connection of the hose, the unmarked truck. This was the undeniable link. Suddenly, Ghost went rigid. He shifted his position, his gaze no longer on the men at the truck, but on the path to their left. He let out a single, sharp, muffled woof. It wasn't a bark. It was a warning. Contact, left flank. Alani swung the camera away from the truck, her blood running cold. She scanned the path and saw them. Two more figures, moving in a low crouch, also armed. They weren't heading for the truck. They were heading directly for her position. It was an ambush. Her reconnaissance hadn't been as clean as she'd thought, or they had anticipated her. Henderson was smarter than she'd given him credit for. He hadn't just fortified the target. He had set a trap for the observer. The protest at the main gate wasn't just a diversion for Kevin. It had also been confirmation for Henderson that something was happening tonight. He had used their plan against them. The two men were closing in, using the roar of the storm as cover. They were 20 yards out and moving fast. There was no time to retreat, no path of escape. She was pinned down. She stopped recording, shoving the camera deep into her pack. The evidence was useless if she was dead or captured. The mission had changed. The objective was no longer observation. It was survival. "Watch him," she whispered to Ghost, her hand resting on his neck. He understood the command, his body thrumming with contained energy. Alani pulled the heavy wrench from her belt, its weight a cold, solid comfort in her hand. The men were almost on top of them. She could hear their breathing, the squelch of their boots in the mud. She flattened herself against the rock, making herself as small as possible. The first man reached the edge of the alcove, his rifle held at the low ready. He peered into the darkness, his eyes not yet adjusted. In that split second of hesitation, Alani moved. She exploded upward from her concealed position, a blur of dark motion. She didn't scream, didn't waste breath. She swung the wrench in a tight, brutal arc, connecting with the man's wrist. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the rifle clattered to the rocks. The man howled in pain. The second man reacted instantly, swinging his own rifle around. But he wasn't fast enough. Ghost launched himself from the shadows, a 90-pound missile of fur and fury. He hit the man square in the chest, driving him backward with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. The man stumbled, firing a wild, panicked shot into the sky before crashing to the ground. Ghost's jaws clamped firmly on his weapon arm. The single gunshot was a thunderclap that cut through the storm's roar. It was a beacon. The two men at the truck shouted, their voices snatched by the wind. They knew where she was. The fight had just begun. The gunshot echoed off the cliffs, a sharp, definitive announcement that the quiet war was over. Alani didn't hesitate. As Ghost kept the second man pinned, his furious growls mixing with the man's panicked shouts, she turned her attention to the first. He was clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of pain and shock. She drove a knee into his solar plexus, and he folded with a groan, collapsing onto the muddy ground. There was no time for finesse, no room for mercy. This was about incapacitation, survival. Headlights from the truck swiveled, their bright beams cutting through the rain and sweeping across the cliff face, searching for the source of the shot. Alani and Ghost were momentarily illuminated, stark silhouettes against the rock. "There! Up there!" a voice yelled from below. The two men by the truck raised their rifles. The game of cat and mouse was over. This was now a firefight, and she was armed with a wrench. "Ghost, with me. Go," she commanded. Ghost released the man's arm and sprinted to her side, a loyal shadow in the chaotic darkness. They scrambled from the alcove, abandoning their high ground for the treacherous, broken terrain of the cliffside. A volley of shots rang out, bullets smacking into the rock where they had been moments before, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. Alani ran, not in a straight line, but in a zigzag pattern, using every rock and stunted tree as cover. Her mind was a cold, efficient machine, processing angles, distances, and threats. The noise in her head was gone, replaced by the pure, singing clarity of combat. This was a language she had been forced to learn, and she was fluent. She needed to separate them, to even the odds. She slid down a steep, muddy embankment, landing in a thicket of thorny bushes that tore at her clothes and skin. Ghost was right behind her. They were now below the main path, in the labyrinth of rocks and gullies that led down to the storm-thrashed beach. The men above were shouting, trying to coordinate. One was staying with the truck, laying down covering fire. The other three, the two from the ambush and one of the original guards, were coming after her. 3-1. And they had guns. "Find Henderson," a voice barked from above. It was the man himself, his voice cutting through the wind. He wasn't just a supervisor, he was a field commander. And he was here. "I want her alive." The order gave her a sliver of hope. They wanted to capture her, not kill her. That meant they would be less likely to use overwhelming, indiscriminate fire. It was a mistake. Her mistake to exploit. She led them on a chase through the darkness, deeper into the warren of rocks. She was faster, more agile, more at home in the wild terrain than they were. They were hunters, but she was the apex predator on this ground. She doubled back, circling around a large rock outcropping. She heard them crashing through the brush behind her, their frustration growing. "Spread out." "She can't have gone far," one of them yelled. They were separating. Another mistake. Alani motioned for Ghost to stay, pressing her hand flat on his head. He sank to the ground, melting into the shadows. She crept forward, the wrench held tight in her hand. She found one of them moving carelessly, his attention focused on the beach below. She came up behind him, a phantom in the storm. She didn't aim for his head. A killing blow was not the objective. She swung the wrench against the back of his knee. His leg buckled, and he went down with a cry of pain, his rifle tumbling from his grasp. 2 down. She scooped up the rifle, a standard M4 carbine, and checked the magazine. Full. The odds had just shifted. The weight of the weapon in her hands was familiar, comforting. It was an extension of her will. The game had changed. Miller? What was that? Report. A voice shouted nearby. Alani didn't answer. She faded back into the darkness, circling again, using their own tactics against them. She could hear the remaining 2 men, moving more cautiously now, calling out to each other. They knew she was armed. She found a new position, a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders, and waited. Her breathing was even, her hands steady on the rifle. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt only the electrifying focus of the hunt. One of them appeared, moving slowly, sweeping his flashlight beam back and forth. The light passed over her crevice once, twice. She held her breath, motionless. He was good. He paused, sensing something was wrong. In that moment of hesitation, Ghost, who had been silently circling from the opposite direction, created the diversion. A sudden, ferocious volley of barks erupted from the darkness to the man's right. He spun toward the sound, startled, raising his rifle. It was the opening Alani needed. She stepped out from the crevice and fired a single, precise shot, not at the man, but at the flashlight in his hand. It exploded in a shower of sparks and glass, plunging him into darkness. He cried out in surprise, firing blindly into the night. Alani was already moving, using the muzzle flashes to pinpoint his position. She tackled him low, driving her shoulder into his midsection. They went down in a tangle of limbs. He was strong, but she used his momentum against him, rolling him over and driving his face into the mud. She disarmed him, her movements swift and brutal. 3 down. Only Henderson remained. Enough. His voice was right behind her. She spun around, bringing her rifle up, but he was too close. He kicked the weapon from her hands, sending it skittering across the wet rocks. He stood there, a large, imposing figure, his face grim in the intermittent flashes of lightning that now illuminated the scene. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding a combat knife, its blade dark and non-reflective. He was former Spec Ops, just like her. He wanted to make this personal. "You're good," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll give you that. But you should have taken the money. It was never about the money," Alani said, her voice tight. She pulled the hatchet from her belt. A rifle against a knife was an execution. A hatchet against a knife was a conversation. They circled each other on the narrow, rocky ledge, the storm-tossed sea roaring below them. This was the final confrontation, not just for a piece of land, but for a soul. He was what she could have become, a soldier who had sold his skills, his honor, to the highest bidder. All that training, he sneered. All that sacrifice, and for what? To live in a shack and protect a bunch of broke fishermen? I took my skills and monetized them. I have a house in the suburbs. A 401k. What do you have? I have this, she said, her voice quiet but fierce. A place worth defending. She lunged, not with the hatchet, but with a low kick aimed at his knee. He sidestepped, countering with a slash of his knife that she barely dodged. The blade sliced through the sleeve of her jacket, drawing a line of fire along her forearm. They came together in a brutal, close-quarters dance. It wasn't fancy. It was ugly, efficient, and deadly. A block, a parry, a strike. He was stronger, but she was faster, fueled by a righteous fury he couldn't comprehend. He feinted high with the knife and swept her legs out from under her. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. He was on her in an instant, his knee on her chest, the point of his knife at her throat. "It's over," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of stale coffee and victory. "You lose," but he had forgotten about the third member of her team. With a savage roar, Ghost launched himself through the air. He didn't go for an arm this time. He went for the threat. His jaws closed on Henderson's knife hand. The man screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony and surprise, as teeth crunched down on bone. The knife dropped from his nerveless fingers. The The momentary release of pressure was all Alani needed. She bucked, throwing him off balance, and scrambled to her feet. She grabbed the fallen knife. Henderson was on his knees, clutching his mangled hand, his face pale with shock. The fight was over. Alani stood over him, the rain washing the blood from her arm, the knife held loosely in her hand. She looked from the broken man at her feet to the loyal dog standing guard beside her, his chest rumbling with a protective growl. She had won, but the mission wasn't complete. She turned and ran, not away, but back towards the cliff top, back towards the truck. Henderson's men were incapacitated, but the evidence was still vulnerable. She found her pack where she had dropped it. The camera was safe. She pulled it out and started recording again, her hands shaking now with adrenaline and exhaustion. She filmed the tanker truck, the hose still connected, and then panned to show the defeated security team, one by one. Finally, she walked to the edge of the cliff and aimed the camera down at the pipe. The pump on the truck was still running. A thick, steady stream of toxic waste was pouring into the churning sea, a dark stain spreading even in the violent water. She had it all. Undeniable proof. The storm raged around her, but inside, Alani felt a profound and sudden calm. The battle was over. The war was won. The storm broke with the dawn. As the last of the bruised purple clouds scurried away to the east, the sun rose over a sea that was calm and slate gray, as if exhausted by its own fury. The air was clean and cold, washed new. Alani stood on the bluff outside the house, a roll of sterile gauze wrapped tightly around the gash on her forearm. She was bruised, aching, and utterly drained, but she was standing. Beside her, Ghost sat, his head resting against her leg. He too was battered, but his tail gave a slow, steady thump against the damp earth. They had held the post. The night's events felt like a fever dream. After recording the final evidence, she had used the captured security radio to make an anonymous call, not to the local sheriff, but directly to the state police and the regional EPA office. She reported an active hazardous waste dump, described the location, and mentioned armed hostiles. She gave them everything they needed to act, then smashed the radio and disappeared back into the woods before the first sirens began their distant wail. By the time the authorities arrived in force, she and Ghost were safely back in the house, watching the flashing blue and red lights converge on the cove from their darkened window. They had watched as Henderson and his men were taken into custody. They had watched as a hazmat team in white suits swarmed the tanker truck. They had watched as the sun came up on a crime scene. Now, in the quiet of the morning, the aftermath began. A message from Jenna came just after sunrise, a simple text on the burner phone Bill had given her. Kevin is safe. Info sent. It's over. Thank you. Alani sank onto the porch step, the tension finally draining from her body, leaving a profound weariness in its place. She leaned her head back against the weathered wood of the house and closed her eyes, listening to the gentle rhythm of the waves. It wasn't the roar of combat or the static of her own trauma. It was just the sea. Peace. A few hours later, a vehicle approached on the coast road. Not a corporate truck or a police cruiser. It was Bill's old, rust-pocked pickup. He pulled up near the house, got out, and walked toward her, carrying a wicker basket. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his pale eyes taking in her bandaged arm, the new scratches on her face, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Heard there was some excitement out this way last night, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. Figured you might be hungry. He set the basket on the steps. It was filled with fresh bread, a thermos of what smelled like fish chowder, cheese, and a bag of jerky for Ghost. An offering. A thank you. The whole town's buzzin', he went on. State cops everywhere. Feds are on their way, I hear. Ethel slapped a no comment on everything, but the story's out. Jenna sent the files to a reporter in Boston she knows. It's gonna be national news, Alani just nodded, too tired to speak. Kevin's a hero, Bill said, a proud smile touching his lips. Kid's got guts. And Jenna, she stood up to those company men at the gate like a Valkyrie. We all did, he looked at Alani, his expression one of deep, abiding respect. But you were the tip of the spear. We never could have done it without you. It was a team effort, she said, her voice quiet. You defended your home. No, Bill said, shaking his head. You showed us it was still worth defending. He didn't stay long. He knew she needed rest. But as he left, something had shifted. She wasn't the outsider on the bluff anymore. She was part of the town, bound to it by shared risk and shared victory. Over the next few days, the story exploded. Ethel Corp's stock plummeted. Federal indictments came down. The corrupt sheriff quietly resigned before he could be arrested. The plant upriver was shut down, its gates chained and locked. Port Blossom, which had been slowly dying, seemed to take a collective breath. There was a new energy in the town. People walked with their heads held a little higher. They were no longer victims. They were survivors. Others came to the house on the bluff. Jenna brought medical supplies and a new book to read. The other fishermen brought a cooler full of fresh-caught fish. They didn't stay long or ask questions about what happened that night on the cliffs. They just came, left their offerings, and gave a nod of respect. They were rebuilding her house, her life, with small acts of kindness. One afternoon, a week after the storm, Alani sat on the porch, cleaning and oiling the tools from Marcus's shed. The work was methodical, calming. Ghost was asleep in a patch of sun, his wounded flank now covered in a healthy patch of new, pink skin and fine, downy fur. She felt a presence and looked up to see Jenna standing there. "Thought you might want this," Jenna said, holding out a laminated card. It was a library card for the Port Blossom Public Library, made out in Alani's name. And this, she handed Alani an envelope. Inside was a properly filed copy of the deed to the house, the title officially and legally transferred to her name. Bill had pulled some strings with a cousin at the county clerk's office. "It's your post, for real now," Jenna said with a small smile. Alani looked at the card, at the deed. Tangible proof. She belonged somewhere. A feeling she hadn't had since she wore a uniform. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "No," Jenna said, her eyes shining. "Thank you. You woke us up." She left, and Alani was alone again with the sound of the sea and the quiet breathing of her dog. She pulled the worn, folded letter from her pocket. Marcus's letter. She smoothed it out and read the last lines again. "It's yours, Lonnie. Your post. Guard it well. Find some peace for both of us." She looked out at the ocean, a vast expanse of brilliant blue under a clear sky. The water in the cove was pristine again. The chemical smell was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of salt and pine. She had guarded it. She had honored his legacy. But the peace she had found wasn't the one she had expected. It wasn't the peace of isolation or emptiness. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the peace of purpose, the peace of connection, the peace that comes from having a place in the world, a community to stand with, and a home worth fighting for. She tucked the letter back into her pocket and walked to the edge of the bluff. Ghost trotted to her side, leaning his weight against her. They stood together, two sentinels, two survivors, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The noise in her head was gone. In its place, there was only the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the sea and the quiet promise of a new day. For those who have served and those who support them, stories of finding peace after the battle are a vital reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. We are honored to share these journeys, and if this one resonated with you, we hope you will continue to follow our channel for more.